The scream tore through the stone halls of Ashgrove Manor at midnight, and every wolf in the pack froze where they stood. It was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of two newborn pups crying in perfect, unbroken unison, a sound so raw that even the guards outside the nursery door pressed their hands over their ears. Inside the room, a young nurse, named Fiona, backed away from the twin cradles, her face pale, her hands trembling. "I did nothing wrong," she whispered, though no one was listening to her. "I fed them the way I was taught. I held them the way I was told. They will not stop." Cade Ashgrove stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his eyes the color of a storm about to break. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Territory, a man whose voice alone could silence a room of 1,000 wolves. But tonight, his own children would not obey even him. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, and looked down into the cradles where his son and daughter lay, their small faces red from crying, their tiny fists clenched as though fighting an enemy no one else could see. "Finn, Wren," he said their names softly, the only softness left in him since the day their mother had died bringing them into the world. He reached down and lifted his daughter first, cradling her against his chest, the way he had done every night for the past 3 weeks. She quieted, if only slightly, burrowing into the warmth of her father's arms. His son continued to wail, kicking his small legs against the blanket. Behind him, Fiona wrung her hands. "My king, I have tried everything. Warm milk, cool milk, singing, silence. The moment I hold them, they scream as though I have struck them. I would never harm them. You must believe that." "I believe you," Cade said, though his voice was tight with exhaustion. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since Mira had closed her eyes for the last time, her final breath spent whispering their children's names. 3 weeks of grief that he had buried so deep inside himself that his own pack had begun to whisper that their king had turned to ice. And now, on top of the grief, this. His children, born of alpha blood, strong enough that the healers said they would grow into powerful wolves one day, could not be soothed by a single hand that touched them. Wren continued to cry. Cade shifted her in his arms, humming low in his throat, and slowly, painfully slowly, her sobs faded into small hiccups. He looked toward his son's cradle, but the moment he reached for Finn with his free arm, the boy's cries grew louder, sharper, as if in protest. "Send for the healer," Cade said. "Now." Fiona ran from the room so quickly her shoes nearly slipped on the polished floor. Cade stood alone with his children in the candlelight, feeling the weight of the crown pressing down on him, harder than it ever had during any war council or border dispute. A kingdom he could rule, enemies he could face without blinking. But 2 tiny pups who would not stop crying had brought him closer to breaking than any battle ever had. The healer arrived within minutes, an older wolf named Doran whose hands had delivered nearly every pup born in Ashgrove territory for the last 30 years. He examined both children carefully, checking their small bodies for any sign of illness or pain, but found nothing wrong. Their hearts beat strong, their lungs were healthy. There was no fever, no rash, no injury. "There is nothing physically wrong with them, my king," Doran said, folding his stethoscope back into his bag. "But I have heard of this before, though rarely, and never twice in one household. Some pups, especially those born of strong bloodlines, can sense things that grown wolves cannot. A wrongness in a bond, a hollow place where a true connection should be." Cade's jaw tightened. "Are you telling me my children are rejecting every nurse because of instinct?" "I am telling you it is possible," Doran said carefully. "Pups this young do not know language, but they know feeling. If the woman holding them does not carry the right warmth, the right steadiness, they may sense it before any of us could explain it in words." "Then find me a nurse whose warmth they will accept," Cade said, his voice low and dangerous, the voice of a king losing patience with a problem that had no clear solution. "I do not care how many candidates it takes. I do not care what rank she holds. Bring me every capable woman in this pack if you must." Doran bowed his head and left to spread the word through the manor. Cade remained standing in the nursery long after the healer's footsteps had faded down the hall, his daughter finally asleep against his shoulder, his son still whimpering softly in his cradle. He thought of Mira, of the way she used to hum an old lullaby while rocking an empty cradle in the months before the twins were born, preparing for a future she would never see. He thought of the promise he had made to her in her final moments, the promise that their children would never feel unloved, never feel alone, no matter what it cost him. He did not know yet how far that promise would take him, or how much it would ask him to change. By morning, word had spread through every corner of Ashgrove territory that the Alpha King's pups had rejected their nurse for the 4th time since their birth. The pack elders gathered in the great hall before the sun had fully risen, their voices low and worried as they debated what this meant for the future of the bloodline. An elder named Alden, a stern wolf with silver hair and a permanent frown, stood at the head of the table and rapped his knuckles against the wood. "This cannot continue," he said. "The pups need consistent care in these early months, or their strength will suffer. We must find a suitable nurse today, and it must be someone of proper standing. The Alpha King's children cannot be raised by just anyone." A woman named Priscilla Thorne, seated near the front of the hall, straightened in her chair. She was the daughter of one of the wealthiest families in the territory, beautiful in the way that commanded attention the moment she entered a room, and she had made no secret of her ambition to become close to the king since his mate's passing. "I would be honored to offer myself as a candidate," she said smoothly. "My family has cared for pups of noble blood for generations. I am certain the children would respond well to me." Alden nodded approvingly. "A fine suggestion. We will bring her forward this afternoon." Elsewhere in the manor, far from the polished halls where the elders debated, a young Omega woman named Alara Vance knelt in the kitchen garden, her hands buried in the dark soil as she pulled weeds from around a row of herbs. She had heard the pups crying the night before, the sound carrying even to the servants' quarters where she slept, and she had lain awake wondering what kind of pain could cause 2 children to cry with such matched, desperate sorrow. She had not slept well since. Something about the sound had settled into her chest and refused to leave. Alara was not like the other women in the pack. She carried the rank of Omega, the lowest standing a wolf could hold, a rank she had been born into and had never been given the chance to rise above. Omegas in Ashgrove territory were rarely spoken to directly by anyone above their station. They cooked, they cleaned, they tended the gardens and mended the linens, and they learned early that the safest way to survive was to remain unseen. Alara had perfected the art of invisibility. She kept her eyes down when higher-ranked wolves passed. She spoke only when spoken to. She had long ago stopped hoping for anything more than a quiet life free of cruelty. It had not always been this way. Her family had once held a respectable position within the pack, but a series of misfortunes years ago, a debt her father could not repay, a rumor that spread faster than truth ever could, had stripped them of their standing overnight. Her parents had passed soon after, leaving Alara to fend for herself, in a world that now looked at her with pity at best, and contempt at most. She had built a small, careful life within the manor's kitchens, and she told herself often that a small life was still a life worth living. Alara, the head housekeeper, a stout woman named Miriam, appeared at the garden gate, her apron dusted with flour. "Stop your weeding, and come help carry linens to the nursery wing. The staff up there are run ragged trying to keep up with the king's demands, and half of them are too busy fussing over which noble candidate will be chosen next to do their actual work." Alara rose, brushing the dirt from her knees, and followed Miriam into the manor without complaint. She had long since learned that complaint accomplished nothing for someone of her rank. The walk to the nursery wing took them through corridors far grander than any she typically saw, tall windows letting in streams of golden morning light, portraits of past Alpha Kings watching from gilded frames. Alara kept her gaze forward and her steps quiet, carrying a stack of fresh linens against her chest. As they approached the nursery, the sound of crying reached them again, softer now than the night before but still unmistakably distressed. Miriam sighed heavily. Poor little things. 4 nurses in 3 weeks, and not one of them has managed to calm them for more than a few minutes. The king looks like he hasn't slept since the day they were born. "What is wrong with them?" Alara asked quietly, unable to stop herself. "No one knows," Miriam said. "The healer says there's nothing physically wrong. Some say it's grief, that they can feel the hollow place their mother left behind, and no substitute can fill it. Others say it's something in their blood, some old wolf instinct that makes them particular about who is allowed to hold them. Whatever it is, it has the whole manor in an uproar." They reached the nursery door, and Miriam knocked softly, before pushing it open. Inside, a flustered young nurse stood near the window, bouncing a wailing pup in her arms, while another wailed in the cradle behind her. The nurse looked near tears herself, her hair falling loose from its pins, dark circles beneath her eyes. "Set the linens on the shelf there," Miriam instructed, gesturing toward a cabinet near the door. Elara did as she was told, moving carefully around the chaos of the room. As she placed the folded linens onto the shelf, her gaze drifted, almost without permission, toward the cradle where the second pup lay crying, his small face scrunched with distress, his tiny hands reaching upward as if searching for something he could not name. Elara did not know what made her do it. She would wonder about it for weeks afterward, turn the moment over and over in her mind, trying to understand the impulse. But in that instant, without thinking, without asking permission, she reached down and gently touched the pup's small hand with one finger. The crying stopped. Not gradually, not slowly fading the way it sometimes did when a pup simply wore itself out. It stopped instantly, as though someone had closed a door on a storm. The boy's tiny fingers curled around Elara's finger. His eyes, still unfocused but open, seemed to search for her face. Across the room, the nurse holding the second pup gasped in surprise, as that pup too quieted mid-wail, turning her small head toward the sound of the silence that had just fallen over her brother. Miriam's mouth fell open. "What did you just do?" "I only touched his hand," Elara said, startled by her own actions, her cheeks flushing red. "I did not mean to interfere. I am sorry. I should not have." "Do not apologize," Miriam said slowly, staring at the cradle in disbelief. "Do it again." Elara hesitated, glancing toward the nurse still holding the second pup, who was watching the scene with wide, uncertain eyes. Carefully, Elara reached into the cradle and lifted the small boy into her arms, the way she had seen other women do, 100 times before, though she herself had never held a child in her life. The boy settled against her immediately, his small body relaxing, his breathing evening out into the soft, steady rhythm of sleep. "Bring the other one," Miriam said, her voice tight with something between disbelief and excitement. The nurse crossed the room, and with visible reluctance, held out the crying girl toward Elara. The moment the pup was within reach, she stopped crying entirely, reaching her small arms toward Elara before she had even been fully passed over. Elara found herself holding both pups, one in each arm, and for the first time since their birth, the nursery fell completely, utterly silent. Miriam stared at the scene for a long moment, before turning and hurrying from the room without another word. Elara stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid that any shift might break whatever fragile peace had settled over the children. The nurse, who had been struggling all morning, sank into a chair by the window, pressing a hand to her chest, as though she could not quite believe what she had just witnessed. "How did you do that?" the nurse whispered. "I do not know," Elara admitted, looking down at the two small faces, now peaceful in her arms. "I have never held a pup before in my life." Neither of them noticed the sound of hurried footsteps approaching the nursery door, nor the murmur of voices rising in the hallway outside, as word began to spread through the manor faster than fire through dry grass. An Omega, the lowest of the low, had done what 4 highly ranked candidates could not, and somewhere in the great hall, that news was about to reach the ears of a king who did not yet know his entire world was about to be turned upside down. The door to the nursery swung open with more force than necessary, and Cade Ashgrove filled the frame once more, his eyes immediately scanning the room, expecting to hear the cries that had haunted him for 3 sleepless weeks. Instead, he found silence. Complete, unbroken silence, and at the center of it, an unfamiliar woman he had never seen before, dressed in the plain gray of a kitchen servant, holding both of his children, as though she had done it 1,000 times. For a moment, no one in the room moved. Cade's gaze moved from his sleeping son to his peaceful daughter, to the stranger holding them both, and something in his chest, something that had been clenched tight since the night Mira died, loosened just slightly, though his expression gave nothing away. "Who are you?" he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "And why are you holding my children?" Elara's heart dropped into her stomach. She had not thought, in the rush of the moment, about what it would mean to be found holding the Alpha King's children without permission, without rank, without any right to be so close to them at all. She dropped into a hurried bow, careful not to jostle the sleeping pups in her arms, her eyes fixed on the polished floor. "Forgive me, my king," she said quickly. "My name is Elara Vance. I was only delivering linens when I saw the children crying. I did not mean to overstep." I will hand them to whoever you wish immediately. Cade did not move from the doorway. His eyes remained on his children, on the way his son's small fist curled against the fabric of Alara's plain dress, on the way his daughter's breathing had settled into the slow, even rhythm of true rest, for what felt like the first time since her birth. He had seen his children cry themselves hoarse in the arms of 4 different women, each one selected for her supposed skill, her rank, her family's reputation. And now they lay quiet in the arms of a servant he did not even recognize. "Explain what happened," he said, stepping fully into the room, his boots silent against the thick carpet. "From the beginning." Alara's hands trembled slightly, though she kept her hold on the pups steady. "I was setting linens on the shelf, my king. Your son was crying, and I do not know what came over me, but I reached out and touched his hand. He stopped crying the moment I did. The nurse thought it might have been chance, so she brought your daughter to me as well, and she stopped crying too. That is all that happened, I swear it." Behind Cade, Miriam appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath from having run to fetch him. "It is true, my king. I saw it myself. I have never witnessed anything like it. The children would not stop crying for anyone else, not even for a moment, but with her they settled instantly, and have not cried since." Cade studied Alara carefully, his gaze sharp and assessing in the way that made most wolves in the pack look away in discomfort. Alara forced herself to hold still, though every instinct in her body urged her to lower her eyes and shrink from the attention. She was not used to being looked at, truly looked at, by anyone of standing, let alone by the Alpha King himself. "You are an Omega," Cade said. It was not a question. "Yes, my king." "And you claim you have never held a pup before this morning." "I have not, my king. I have no younger siblings, and I have never been trusted with the care of any child in this manner." Cade's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Alara feared she had said something wrong, though she could not imagine what. In truth, Cade's frustration was not directed at her at all. It was directed at the situation itself, at the impossibility of what he was witnessing, at the fact that his own instincts, the instincts of an alpha, told him that an omega should have no place near his heirs, and yet the evidence in front of him could not be denied. His children, who had rejected every carefully chosen candidate the pack elders had presented, lay peacefully asleep in the arms of a woman with no rank, no training, and no claim to their care. "Give them to me," he said finally. Alara moved carefully, stepping toward him with slow, deliberate movements, and gently transferred his daughter into his waiting arms first. The moment the girl left Alara's hold, her small face crumpled, and within seconds, she was crying again, her tiny body stiffening with distress. Cade tried to soothe her the way he had every night for 3 weeks, rocking her gently, murmuring low words, but her cries only grew louder. Alara moved to hand him his son as well, thinking perhaps both children together in his arms might calm them, but the moment the boy left her grasp, he too began to wail, the 2 voices rising in the same matched, desperate unison that had echoed through the manor the night before. Cade stood frozen, holding both of his crying children, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betraying something close to disbelief. He looked at Alara, who stood with her hands now empty, and folded nervously in front of her, unsure whether she had done something wrong or something extraordinary. "Take her back," Cade said quietly. Miriam blinked. "My king?" "Take my daughter," Cade repeated, holding the crying girl out toward Alara. The moment Alara accepted her into her arms, the crying stopped almost instantly, the girl's small body relaxing against her once more. Cade watched this with a stillness that unsettled everyone in the room, and then, testing something even he did not fully understand, he held his son out as well. The moment the boy settled against Alara's other arm, his cries faded too, leaving only the soft sound of contented breathing. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy. Cade stood with his empty arms at his sides, staring at the scene before him as though trying to solve a puzzle that had no clear pieces. His children, born of the strongest bloodline in the Northern Territory, would not settle in the arms of their own father, and yet they had found peace with a woman who held no rank at all. "Leave us," Cade said finally, his voice low. Miriam hesitated, glancing at Alara with an expression somewhere between concern and curiosity, before bowing and slipping out of the room, pulling the door shut softly behind her. The other nurse, still seated by the window, rose quietly and followed her out. clearly relieved to be excused from whatever was about to happen next. Alara remained standing in the center of the nursery, both pups asleep in her arms, alone now with the Alpha King. She had never in her life been alone in a room with someone of his standing, and the weight of the moment pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe evenly. She waited, eyes lowered, for whatever judgment he was about to pass. Cade moved slowly around the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze moving from his children to the woman holding them, and back again. "How long have you served in this manner?" he asked. "Since I was a child, my king. My family lost their standing many years ago. I have worked in the kitchens and gardens since then. And in all that time, no one has ever asked you to care for a pup. No, my king. Omegas are rarely trusted with such responsibilities." Cade was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as though he were chewing over words he did not particularly want to say. He had grown up believing, as every wolf in his pack believed, that rank determined worth, that Omegas held their place at the bottom of the hierarchy, for reasons rooted in something deeper than mere circumstance. It was not a belief he had ever questioned, not truly, not until this moment, when the evidence before him refused to align with everything he had been taught. "The healer believes my children can sense something in the wolves who hold them," he said slowly. "A wrongness, or perhaps a rightness, that the rest of us cannot perceive. If that is true, then whatever they sense in you, they do not sense in anyone else who has tried to care for them." Alara said nothing, unsure of what response would be appropriate, unsure if she was even meant to respond at all. Cade continued pacing, his mind working through the implications of what he was witnessing, implications that unsettled him deeply. If his own instincts as an alpha told him that an omega had no place near his heirs, and yet his children's instincts told them the opposite, then one of those instincts had to be wrong. And Cade Ashgrove was not a man accustomed to being wrong. "I came here today to remove you from this room," he admitted, his voice quieter now, almost reluctant. "I intended to have you reassigned to your previous duties, and to find a more suitable candidate before nightfall. That was my full intention, when Miriam told me an Omega had been left alone with my children." Ilara's stomach tightened. "I understand, my king. I will return to the kitchens whenever you wish." "That is not what I am saying." Cade stopped pacing, and turned to face her fully, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though something in his gaze also held her steady. "I cannot ignore what I have seen with my own eyes. My children have rejected 4 candidates chosen for their skill and standing, and yet they settled instantly in your arms, a woman with no training and no rank. I do not understand it, and I am not certain I like it, but I cannot deny it." He fell silent, weighing something in his mind, and Alara waited, her arms beginning to ache slightly from holding both pups for so long, though she would not have set them down for anything in the world in that moment. Finally Cade spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of a decision he clearly had not expected to make. "You will remain here, in the nursery wing, until we understand what this means," he said, "temporarily, under close watch. I will not pretend this arrangement sits easily with me, and I expect there will be those in this pack who object strongly to an Omega being given such a position. But my children's well-being matters more to me than tradition, at least for now." Relief and disbelief warred in Alara's chest, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, unsure of how much emotion was appropriate to show in front of the king. "Thank you, my king. I will do everything I can to care for them properly." "See that you do." Cade's voice hardened slightly, the softness of the moment before retreating behind the mask of authority he wore so easily. "You will report any concerns to Miriam immediately. You will not take the children outside the manor grounds without my express permission, and you will remember, at all times, that your position here is temporary and can be revoked the moment I decide it is no longer necessary." "Yes, my king." He looked at his children one last time, sleeping soundly in the arms of a woman he barely knew, a woman his own instincts told him should have no claim to them at all. Something in his chest twisted uncomfortably, a feeling he could not quite name, somewhere between gratitude and unease. He turned and left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, leaving Alara alone with the 2 small lives that had, in the span of a single morning, completely upended everything she had ever understood about her place in the world. She did not know, as she settled into the rocking chair by the window with a pup cradled in each arm, that the decision made in that room would ripple outward through the entire pack within hours, stirring resentment among those who believed rank should never be questioned, and curiosity among those who wondered what secret truth the pups had sensed that no one else could see. She did not know that Priscilla Thorne, waiting eagerly in the great hall to be presented as the next candidate, would soon learn that the position had already been filled, and filled by someone she considered beneath her notice entirely. She only knew, in that quiet moment, that for the first time since she could remember, she had been trusted with something precious, and she intended to guard that trust with everything she had. Outside the nursery door, unseen by anyone, a shadow lingered a moment longer than necessary, before moving quickly down the hallway to spread the news that would soon reach every corner of Ashgrove territory. News traveled through Ashgrove Manor faster than a wolf could run, and by the time the sun reached its highest point in the sky, every servant, guard, and pack member had heard some version of the story. In the kitchens, cooks whispered over simmering pots that an Omega girl had somehow tamed the crying pups with nothing more than a touch. In the training yard, warriors muttered among themselves about how strange it was that the king had allowed such a thing to happen at all, and in the great hall, where Priscilla Thorne had spent the morning preparing herself to be presented as the newest candidate for the position, the news landed like a slap across her carefully composed face. "An Omega," she repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You are telling me the Alpha King chose an Omega kitchen girl over me." Alden, standing beside her with his arms crossed, looked equally displeased, though he masked it better than she did. "It seems the pups responded to her in a way they have responded to no one else. The king has allowed her to remain, temporarily, until the situation can be better understood." Temporarily. Priscilla's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "Then it can be undone. That is not for you to decide," Alden said, though there was something in his tone that suggested he did not entirely disagree with her displeasure. "The king has made his decision, and we will respect it for now. But make no mistake, Priscilla, many in this pack will not accept an Omega raising the future heirs of Ashgrove territory. This arrangement will face resistance, and it will not last if the elders have anything to say about it." Priscilla's eyes narrowed, calculating. She had spent months positioning herself as the ideal candidate to grow close to the grieving king, envisioning a future where her influence over his children would eventually translate into influence over the pack itself. She was not about to let a servant girl with no rank and no family standing dismantle everything she had worked toward. "Then perhaps," she said slowly, "we should ensure the arrangement does not last very long at all." Meanwhile, in the nursery wing, Elara remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering against her. The afternoon passed in a haze of small, unfamiliar tasks. Miriam had returned shortly after the king's departure, bringing with her a stack of instructions on feeding schedules, proper handling, and the delicate art of soothing pups to sleep, all of which Elara absorbed with quiet, careful attention. She had never been given the chance to learn anything so important before, and she was determined not to fail at it. "You are a natural," Miriam admitted grudgingly, as she watched Elara settle Wren into her cradle for a nap, humming a soft tune under her breath, one she remembered her own mother singing to her, many years ago, before misfortune had stripped away everything her family once had. "I have raised 3 pups of my own, and I have never seen an infant settle so quickly and so completely." "I do not understand it either," Elara admitted. "I only know that when I hold them, I feel as though I am supposed to be here. It is a strange feeling. I have never felt it before, not about anything." Miriam studied her for a long moment, an unreadable expression crossing her weathered face. "Be careful, child. There are those in this pack who will not be pleased to see an Omega given such a position, however temporary it may be. Keep your head down, do your work well, and do not give anyone a reason to find fault with you." Elara nodded, though the warning settled uneasily in her stomach. She had spent her entire life keeping her head down, avoiding attention, staying invisible to protect herself from a pack that had never valued her. Now, suddenly, she was the center of attention in a manor full of powerful wolves who had every reason to resent her presence, and she did not know how to navigate a world where she could no longer disappear into the background. Her fears were not unfounded. By evening, the first signs of resistance had already begun to surface. When Elara went down to the kitchens to collect a tray of food for herself, the room fell silent the moment she entered, conversations dying on the lips of the other servants. She had worked alongside these people for years, sharing meals and small kindnesses in the quiet moments between chores, but now they looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and envy that made the familiar room feel foreign and cold. "Well, look who it is," said a voice from near the hearth. A young woman named Ivy, who had once been Alara's closest thing to a friend among the kitchen staff, stood with her arms crossed, her expression tight. The nursery girl herself, gracing us with her presence. "Ivy," Alara said carefully, "I did not choose this. It happened by accident." By accident. Ivy's laugh held no warmth. "Do you know what people are saying about you? That you have bewitched the pups somehow. That there is something unnatural about an Omega being trusted with the king's children. Do you understand what kind of attention that brings? The elders do not take kindly to Omegas rising above their station, even accidentally." Alara's chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I am not trying to rise above anything. I am only doing what I have been asked to do. If the king wishes to remove me tomorrow, I will return to the kitchens without complaint." "See that you remember that," said an older cook near the stove, not unkindly, but with clear warning in her tone. "This manor has rules for a reason, and those rules exist to keep the peace. Pups or no pups, an Omega has no business being raised up above her betters. It will not end well for you, mark my words." Alara took her tray and left the kitchen without further argument, her appetite gone, the weight of the day's events pressing down on her shoulders as she made her way back through the quiet corridors toward the nursery wing. She had known, even in the first moments of holding the crying pups, that accepting this position would come with consequences. She had not expected the consequences to arrive so quickly, or to hurt quite so much. Back in the nursery, she found both pups awake and fussing slightly, though nothing like the desperate wails that had plagued them for the past 3 weeks. She set aside her tray and lifted Finn first, settling into the rocking chair and holding him against her shoulder, as she had learned to do throughout the day. His small body relaxed almost instantly, and Alara felt some of the day's tension ease from her own chest as well. Whatever the rest of the pack thought of her, whatever resentment and suspicion followed her through the halls, in this room, with these 2 small lives, she felt something she had never felt before. She felt needed. She did not notice the door open quietly behind her, nor the figure that lingered in the threshold, watching the scene with an expression far more complicated than simple curiosity. Cade had come to check on his children before retiring for the night, a habit he had maintained every evening since their birth, though it had always been accompanied by dread at what state he might find them in. Tonight, he found something entirely different. He found Alara sitting in the rocking chair, humming softly, his son settled peacefully against her shoulder, his daughter beginning to drift toward sleep in the cradle nearby. The scene struck him with an unexpected force, a quiet domesticity he had not witnessed in this room since Mira had first begun preparing the nursery for their arrival, back when she still had months left to live, back when the future had still seemed bright and certain. He remained in the doorway for several minutes, unwilling to disturb the moment, studying the woman his children had chosen, without any input from him at all. She was not what he would have expected. Her dress was plain, her hands roughened from years of labor, her posture careful in the way of someone who had learned to make herself small in order to survive. And yet there was something steady in the way she held his son, something patient and unhurried, qualities he had not seen in any of the previous candidates, all of whom had approached the task with a nervous eagerness to please him, rather than genuine care for the children themselves. Alara finally noticed him standing there, and she startled slightly, rising carefully from the chair without disturbing Finn's sleep. "My king, I did not hear you enter. Forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive," Cade said, stepping into the room and closing the door softly behind him. "You are doing exactly what I asked of you." He moved closer, looking down at his sleeping son with an expression Alara could not quite read, something between wonder and old grief tangled together. "He has not slept this soundly since the night he was born," Cade said quietly, almost to himself. "None of them have. Not truly. Not since their mother." Alara did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch between them, comfortable in a way she had not expected a silence with the Alpha King to ever feel. Cade reached out, hesitating only slightly, and brushed a gentle finger against his son's small hand. Finn stirred but did not wake, his tiny fingers curling instinctively around his father's, and something in Cade's chest loosened at the small, simple gesture. "I have heard," he said after a long moment, "that some of the staff have not been kind to you today." Alara's eyes widened slightly, surprised that word of the kitchen's coldness had reached him so quickly. "It is nothing I cannot manage, my king. I have faced worse." "That is not an answer that reassures me," Cade said, his voice carrying a sharper edge now, though it was not directed at her. "You are caring for my children. I will not have you mistreated for it, regardless of your rank. With respect, my king, I do not believe your protection will change how the pack views an Omega raised above her station, even temporarily. These things run deeper than a single command." Cade studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his storm-colored eyes. He had spent his entire life believing in the rigid order of the pack, the same order that placed Omegas at the very bottom, deserving of little consideration and less respect. He had never questioned it, not truly, because questioning it had never been necessary. But standing here now, watching this woman his own children had chosen over every highly ranked candidate presented to them, he found himself questioning it for the first time in his life, and the feeling was deeply unsettling. "Get some rest," he said finally, stepping back from the cradle. "Tomorrow will not be easier than today, I suspect. But you have my word that I will not allow this pack to punish you, simply for doing what my children need." He left the room without waiting for her response, and Alara stood alone in the quiet nursery, holding his sleeping son against her chest, wondering what exactly she had stumbled into, and whether the king's protection would be enough to shield her from what was still to come. 3 days passed, and with each one, Alara settled further into a rhythm she had never imagined for herself. She woke before dawn to prepare the pups for the morning, learned the particular rhythms of Finn's hunger and Wren's need for constant motion to fall asleep, and spent long hours in the rocking chair by the window, watching the sun move across the sky, while 2 small lives depended entirely on her steady presence. The exhaustion was real, deeper than any labor she had known in the kitchens, but it came paired with something she had never experienced before, a sense of purpose that filled the hollow places inside her she had long since stopped noticing. The resistance from the rest of the pack, however, did not fade. If anything, it grew sharper as the days passed, and it became clear that the king had no immediate intention of removing her from her position. Priscilla Thorne had not given up on her ambitions, and she found new ways each day to remind Alara, and everyone else in the manor, of exactly where an Omega belonged in the natural order of things. It began with small cruelties, the kind that left no visible mark but wore steadily at a person's spirit. Alara would find her meals mysteriously delayed, arriving cold long after the rest of the staff had already eaten. Fresh linens meant for the nursery would go missing, forcing her to search the manor at odd hours, while trying to keep both pups content in the meantime. Once, she returned from a brief errand to find the nursery door locked from the outside, and it took nearly 20 minutes of desperate knocking before a sympathetic young guard finally heard her and let her back in, the pups crying inside the whole time, distressed at her sudden absence. "It was Priscilla," the guard admitted quietly, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "I saw her near the door, not long before you returned. I did not think anything of it at the time, but I would be careful, if I were you. She does not take kindly to being denied what she believes she deserves." Alara thanked him and said nothing more, though her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the crying pups back into her arms, soothing them with the same soft humming that had become second nature to her over the past days. She could not prove Priscilla had been responsible, and even if she could, she doubted anyone would take the word of an Omega over the daughter of one of the wealthiest families in the territory. She resolved, as she had resolved so many times before in her life, to simply endure and say nothing, to make herself as small a target as possible, and hope the storm would pass on its own. But the storm did not pass. If anything, it gathered strength with each passing day, fed by whispers that spread through every corner of the pack, whispers that questioned not just Alara's fitness for the role, but the very foundation of the hierarchy that governed their lives. Some among the pack, quiet and unspoken as their thoughts remained, found themselves wondering, for the first time, whether the rigid lines between Alpha, Beta, and Omega truly reflected anything real, or whether they were simply walls, built long ago, and never questioned since. Alden, watching the situation unfold with growing concern, requested an audience with Cade on the 4th day, finding the king in his study late in the evening, a stack of unread correspondence piled untouched on his desk, his attention clearly elsewhere despite the papers before him. "My king," Alden began carefully, "I understand your reasoning for allowing the Omega to remain with the pups. Their well-being must come first. I agree entirely. But I would be remiss if I did not warn you that this arrangement is causing unrest throughout the pack. There are those who believe it undermines the very structure that keeps us stable." Cade set down his pen and regarded the elder with a level gaze. "And what would you have me do, Alden? Remove her and allow my children to return to their previous state, crying without end, refusing every candidate you and the other elders present? I have watched 4 highly ranked women fail where a servant with no training succeeded within moments. I am not interested in tradition, for tradition's sake, when my children's well-being hangs in the balance. I understand your concern, my king, truly. But consider the message this sends. If an Omega can rise to such a position, simply because the pups favor her, what does that mean for the structure of our entire pack? Rank exists for a reason. It maintains order. Without it, we risk chaos." Cade was silent for a long moment, turning the words over in his mind. He had asked himself similar questions in the quiet hours of the night, questions he had not expected to face when he first agreed to let Alara remain in the nursery. But each time he visited his children and found them calm, well cared for, and genuinely happy, for the first time since their mother's death, the doubts felt smaller, less significant than the elders wished them to be. "I will consider your concerns," Cade said finally, though his tone made clear the conversation was over. "But I will not act against my children's well-being, simply to soothe the pride of those who cannot accept an inconvenient truth. If you have further concerns, Alden, bring them to me directly. I will not tolerate the kind of quiet cruelty I have heard is being directed toward her in the meantime." Alden inclined his head, though his expression remained troubled as he left the study. Cade sat alone for a long while afterward, staring at the flickering candle on his desk, his mind wandering, unbidden, back to the nursery, to the image of Alara humming softly while his children slept peacefully in her care. He found himself thinking of her more often than he wished to admit, wondering about the life that had led her to become someone so easily dismissed by the pack, someone who nonetheless possessed a quiet strength that no amount of rank or wealth seemed able to replicate. The following morning, Cade made an unannounced visit to the nursery, arriving earlier than usual, before the sun had fully risen over the eastern hills. He found Alara already awake, moving quietly around the room as she prepared for the day, humming the same gentle tune he had heard her sing before. She startled slightly when she noticed him, offering a quick, careful bow. "My king, I did not expect you so early." "I could not sleep," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of the answer. He had not intended to share something so personal, but the words came easily, in the quiet stillness of the early morning nursery. "I find myself thinking of many things lately that I had not considered before." Alara said nothing, unsure of how to respond to such an admission, from a man she still barely knew, a man whose approval or disapproval could determine the entire course of her future. Cade moved to the window, looking out over the grounds as the first light of morning began to spread across the sky, painting the manor's gardens in soft shades of gold and rose. "Tell me about your family," he said, not turning to look at her, before whatever misfortune befell them. Alara hesitated, unused to being asked such personal questions by anyone, let alone the Alpha King himself, but something in his tone, quiet and genuinely curious rather than commanding, encouraged her to answer honestly. "My father held a respected position once, working closely with the pack's trade dealings. When I was young, a debt he could not repay led to accusations that were never fully proven, but never fully disproven either. The pack turned against him quickly, and once the tide shifted, there was no reversing it. My parents passed within a few years of each other, worn down, I believe, by the shame of it all more than by any illness. I was left to fend for myself soon after, and the kitchens were the only place willing to take me in." Cade listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what she had shared. "That is an injustice," he said finally. "A family's entire standing destroyed over an accusation that was never proven. That is not how a fair pack should function. It is how this pack has always functioned, my king. Ilara said softly, without bitterness, simply stating a truth she had accepted long ago. I stopped expecting fairness many years ago. It is easier that way. Something about the quiet resignation in her voice unsettled Cade more than any argument Alden could have made. He turned from the window to look at her fully, studying her face in the soft morning light, searching for something he could not quite name. You should not have to accept unfairness as simply the way things are, he said. No one should. Ilara met his gaze, surprised by the intensity behind his words, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them charged with something neither was quite ready to acknowledge. It was Wren's soft stirring in her cradle that finally broke the moment, and Ilara moved quickly to attend to her, grateful for the distraction, though she found her thoughts returning to the king's words long after he had left the room that morning, turning them over in her mind like a puzzle she could not quite solve. A full week passed, and the pups grew visibly stronger under Ilara's steady care. Their cries, once constant and desperate, became rare, reserved only for genuine hunger or discomfort rather than the deep distress that had plagued them since birth. Doran the healer, visiting for a routine examination, remarked with obvious relief that both children had gained healthy weight and showed none of the concerning signs he had worried about in their first weeks of life. Whatever instinct guided them to her, Doran told Cade privately after the examination, it has served them well. I have rarely seen pups this young thrive so quickly. Whatever you decide regarding the larger questions of rank and tradition, my king, I would strongly advise against removing her from their care. The bond they share with her appears to run deeper than simple comfort. It may be tied to their very health. Cade absorbed this information with a complicated mixture of relief and continued unease. He had grown, over the course of the week, more comfortable with Ilara's presence in the nursery, finding himself visiting more often than strictly necessary, drawn by the quiet peace that had settled over the room since her arrival. But comfort within these walls did not erase the tension building beyond them, tension that reached a breaking point on the morning Priscilla Thorne requested an urgent audience with the full council of elders. She arrived dressed in her finest clothing, her expression carefully composed into one of grave concern rather than obvious ambition, though those who knew her well could see the calculation beneath the performance. I have come forward, she announced to the gathered elders, because I believe there is something the pack deserves to know, something that concerns the safety of the Alpha King's heirs. Alden, seated at the head of the council table, gestured for her to continue, his expression wary. Speak plainly, Priscilla. What is this concern? I have made inquiries into the Omega currently caring for the pups, Priscilla said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber. Ilara Vance, her family's disgrace, as many of you will recall, involved accusations of dishonesty and debt that were never fully resolved. I have also learned, through careful investigation, that her lineage carries an irregularity that has gone unrecorded in our pack's official histories for many years, an old bloodline, erased from the records generations ago, tied to circumstances the pack chose to forget rather than confront. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Alden leaned forward, his interest sharpening, despite his obvious distrust of Priscilla's motives. Explain what you mean by an irregularity. I do not have the full details, Priscilla admitted, though her tone suggested she had rehearsed this admission carefully. But I believe it warrants investigation before we allow her continued, unsupervised access to the future heirs of this territory. Who knows what unknown blood runs through her veins, or what intentions might lie hidden beneath her humble appearance. I raise this not out of personal ambition, elders, but out of genuine concern for the safety of children who cannot yet protect themselves. Alden studied her for a long moment, unconvinced by her stated motives, but unable to entirely dismiss the substance of her claim. An erased bloodline was not something to be ignored, regardless of who had brought it to light. I will speak with the king regarding this matter, he said finally. In the meantime, the Omega will remain under close observation. If there is truth to this claim, we will uncover it. Word of the council's discussion reached Cade by midday, delivered by Alden himself with visible reluctance, aware of how the news might be received. Cade listened in silence, his expression darkening, as the elder relayed Priscilla's claims, though his anger, when it finally surfaced, was directed in an unexpected direction. An erased bloodline, Cade repeated slowly. And how, precisely, does one erase a bloodline from official record, Alden? That is not a simple accident of clerical oversight. That requires deliberate action, taken by someone with the authority to do so. Alden shifted uncomfortably. I do not know the details, my king. I only relay what has been brought forward. Then find out, Cade said, his voice hard. I want the full truth of this matter, not rumors spread by a woman with obvious motives of her own. If there is something in Alara's lineage worth understanding, I want it understood properly, through honest investigation, not through the whispers of someone attempting to remove a rival from her path. Alden bowed and left to begin the inquiry, though privately he wondered whether the truth, once uncovered, would prove more complicated than either the king or Priscilla anticipated. Records in Ashgrove territory stretched back many generations, kept in a vast archive beneath the manor, that few wolves bothered to consult except in matters of significant dispute. If a bloodline had truly been erased, someone would need to search deep into those forgotten pages to find any trace of what had once been recorded and later removed. Meanwhile, unaware of the storm building around her, Alara continued her days in the nursery, finding small joys in the routine that had once felt impossible for someone of her station to hope for. She had begun teaching herself simple lullabies from half-remembered fragments of her mother's voice, singing them softly to the pups each evening as she settled them for sleep. She had learned Finn's particular fondness for being held facing outward so he could observe the room around him, and Wren's preference for gentle rocking motion over stillness. Small details, perhaps insignificant to anyone else, but precious to Alara, who had never before been given the chance to know another living creature so intimately. It was during one such quiet evening that Cade found himself once again drawn to the nursery, ostensibly to check on his children, but in truth, seeking out the particular stillness that had become rare and precious to him since Mira's passing. He found Alara seated by the window, Finn asleep against her shoulder, humming a tune he did not recognize, her voice soft and slightly unsteady in the way of someone who had learned a song by memory rather than proper instruction. "What is that song?" he asked quietly, not wanting to startle her. Alara looked up, her humming trailing off. "A lullaby my mother used to sing to me, many years ago. I do not remember all the words, only the melody. I hope it is not inappropriate to sing it to your children." "It is not inappropriate," Cade said, moving closer, settling into the chair across from her, without quite meaning to stay as long as he knew he would. "It is beautiful. Please, continue, if you are willing." Alara hesitated only a moment before resuming the soft melody, and Cade closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself a rare moment of peace amid the constant weight of leadership and grief that had defined nearly every waking hour since his mate's death. When the song ended, silence settled comfortably between them, neither feeling the need to fill it with unnecessary words. "I must tell you something," Cade said eventually, his voice careful. "There are concerns being raised regarding your family's history, questions about a bloodline that may have been erased from our official records many generations ago. I do not yet know what truth lies behind these claims, but I wanted you to hear it from me directly, rather than through the whispers already spreading through the manor." Alara's expression tightened with visible worry, though she kept her voice steady. "I know very little of my family's history beyond what happened to my parents. If there is truth to this claim, I am not aware of it, my king. I swear that to you honestly." "I believe you," Cade said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it completely. "Whatever truth we uncover, know that I do not intend to use it against you. If anything, I suspect the truth may prove far more interesting than the rumors Priscilla hopes to spread." Alara studied him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of the calculated distance she had expected from a king, from someone of his standing, but found instead something that looked remarkably like genuine concern. "Why do you care so much about protecting me, my king? I am only an Omega who happened to soothe your children when others could not. You owe me nothing beyond what has already been given." Cade was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully, aware that whatever he said next carried weight beyond the simple words themselves. "Because," he said finally, "in the short time you have been here, you have shown my children more genuine care than anyone else has managed since their mother died. And because, if I am honest with myself, I have come to value your presence here, for reasons that extend beyond my children's well-being alone." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either had intended, and Alara felt her cheeks flush warm despite herself. She did not know how to respond to such an admission, unused to anyone, let alone the Alpha King himself, speaking to her with such unguarded honesty. Before she could find the words, a soft cry rose from Ren's cradle, breaking the fragile moment, and both of them moved quickly to attend to the pup, grateful, perhaps, for the interruption that spared them from having to navigate feelings neither was quite ready to name. The archive beneath Ashgrove Manor stretched deep into the earth, rows upon rows of shelves holding records that spanned centuries of the pack's history. Alden descended the narrow stone stairs with a lantern in hand, accompanied by an elderly archivist named Edwin, whose knowledge of the manor's oldest documents was unmatched by anyone else still living. The air grew cooler and heavier with each step, thick with the scent of old parchment, and dust undisturbed for generations. If a bloodline was truly erased, Edwin said, running his fingers along the spines of ancient ledgers as they walked, it would not have been a simple matter. Our records are cross-referenced in multiple locations, birth registries, marriage contracts, land holdings. To erase someone entirely, one would need to alter records across several different archives, a task requiring both authority and considerable effort. Then let us begin with the birth registries, Alden said. Alara Vance's family name was Vance before her father's disgrace. If there is any irregularity in her lineage, it should appear somewhere in the records from that branch of the family. They spent hours combing through brittle pages, tracing the Vance family line back through generations of births, marriages, and deaths, each entry carefully recorded in the careful handwriting of archivists long since passed. It was well past midnight when Edwin's fingers stilled on a particular page, his brow furrowing as he studied an entry that seemed, at first glance, unremarkable. Here, he said quietly, holding the lantern closer to the faded ink. A marriage record, nearly 80 years ago, between a Vance daughter and a wolf, that family name has been struck through, the ink deliberately smudged in a way that suggests intentional obscuring, rather than natural fading. This is highly unusual. Alden leaned in, studying the altered entry with growing concern. Struck through deliberately, that confirms someone wished to hide this connection. Can you determine what the original name might have been? Edwin retrieved a magnifying glass from his coat pocket and examined the page with painstaking care, tilting it at various angles beneath the lantern light. After several long minutes, he let out a slow breath. I believe I can make out a partial fragment. The remaining letters suggest a name, beginning with the sound Ash, though the rest has been too thoroughly obscured to determine with certainty. Ash, Alden repeated slowly, a chill settling over him as the implication became clear. As in Ashgrove. The two men stared at each other in the dim lantern light, the weight of the discovery settling heavily between them. If the fragment truly belonged to the Ashgrove family name, it would mean that Alara's lineage connected, however distantly, to the very bloodline she now served. It would explain, in ways neither of them had previously considered, why the pups might sense something in her that they sensed in no one else. A distant echo of shared blood, buried generations deep, deliberately hidden from official record. We must inform the king immediately, Alden said, already gathering the fragile ledger with careful hands, determined to preserve the evidence before it could be lost or, worse, deliberately destroyed by someone hoping to keep the truth buried. They found Cade still awake in his study despite the late hour, and the moment he saw the grave expressions on both their faces, he set aside the papers before him and gave them his full attention. Alden laid the ancient ledger open on the desk, pointing to the altered entry, and explained everything they had discovered in the depths of the archive. Cade studied the page in silence for a long moment, his expression difficult to read in the flickering candlelight. A connection to my own bloodline, he said finally, deliberately erased 80 years ago. Do we know why? Not yet, my king, Alden admitted. The alteration itself tells us only that someone wished this connection hidden, not the reason behind it. We would need to search further, perhaps consult records regarding land disputes or inheritance conflicts from that period, to understand the full context. Then search further, Cade said, his voice carrying an intensity that made clear this matter had become deeply personal to him. I want the full truth uncovered, regardless of what it reveals or how long it takes. Over the following days, Alden and Edwin continued their careful investigation, piecing together fragments of history, scattered across dozens of separate documents. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, one far more complex than a simple family connection. 80 years ago, a younger son of the Ashgrove line, a wolf who would have held significant standing, had circumstances been different. Had fallen in love with a woman from a family the pack elders of that era considered beneath proper consideration. Rather than accept a marriage that threatened to complicate the succession and inheritance disputes already brewing within the ruling family, the elders of that generation had quietly arranged for the younger son's branch to be erased from official record entirely, his descendants stripped of any claim to the Ashgrove name, and blended, deliberately, into ordinary pack life, without knowledge of their true origins. It appears, Edwin explained to Cade and Alden, once the full picture had come together, that Alara's family was never truly disgraced, through any fault of their own, at least not initially. The debt and dishonesty that led to their downfall generations later may well have been circumstances arranged or exploited by those who wished to ensure the erased line never rose to prominence again, never posed any threat to the established succession. It is a tragedy, layered upon a tragedy, my king, one this pack has carried unknowingly for 80 years. Cade sat in stunned silence, absorbing the full weight of what had been revealed. The woman his own children had chosen, the woman his pack had scorned and mistreated for her entire life, carried Ashgrove blood in her veins, hidden and denied through no fault of her own by elders long dead, who had valued political convenience over honesty and fairness. It explained everything, the pups' instinctive recognition of her, the deep sense of rightness that had drawn them to her from the very first touch. They had not simply chosen a kind stranger. They had recognized, in some deep instinctive way that transcended conscious understanding, a connection of true kinship that the pack's own records had tried, and ultimately failed, to erase. She must be told, Cade said finally, rising from his chair. Immediately. This truth belongs to her more than to anyone else in this pack. He found Alara in the nursery, as he so often did in these late evening hours. Both pups finally settled for the night, and she looked up at his entrance with the same careful, uncertain expression she still wore whenever he arrived unannounced, still unused to his frequent presence despite the weeks that had passed. Cade closed the door behind him and crossed the room, settling into the chair across from her, the ancient ledger held carefully in his hands. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I ask that you listen fully before you respond, because what I am about to share will likely change how you understand your own history." Over the following half hour, Cade explained everything Alden and Edwin had uncovered, the erased branch of his own family line, the deliberate obscuring of records, the tragic chain of circumstances that had led, ultimately, to Alara growing up believing herself simply an ordinary Omega, with no claim to anything beyond her own hard-won survival. Alara listened in stunned silence, her hands trembling slightly as Cade turned the ancient ledger toward her, showing her the faded, deliberately smudged entry that connected her family, however distantly, to his own. "I do not understand," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are telling me that I share blood with your family, that the pack's treatment of my family, the disgrace, the poverty, all of it, was built on a lie, constructed generations before I was even born." "It appears so," Cade said quietly. "I cannot undo what was done to your family, Alara, nor can I fully explain the cruelty of those who chose political convenience over honesty so many years ago. But I can ensure that the truth is no longer hidden, and I can ensure that you are never again treated as though you hold no value in this pack." Alara looked down at the faded ledger, tears gathering in her eyes that she could not quite explain. A complicated mixture of grief for the family history stolen from her, and something that felt almost like relief, as though a piece of herself she had never known was missing, had suddenly, unexpectedly, been restored. "This explains why they trust me," she whispered, looking toward the cradles where Finn and Wren slept peacefully. "It was never simple chance at all." "No," Cade agreed softly. "It was never simple chance." The discovery of Alara's true lineage did not remain private for long. Within days, whispers of the erased bloodline spread through Ashgrove territory, with the same speed that had once carried rumors of her failures as an unlikely nursemaid. But this time, the whispers carried a different weight, forcing many within the pack to reconsider everything they had assumed about the woman they had so easily dismissed. Priscilla Thorne received the news with visible shock during a gathering of the council, her carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time since she had begun her campaign against Alara. "This cannot be verified," she insisted, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Records can be misread." "Fragments of smudged ink," prove nothing conclusive. The records have been examined thoroughly, Alden said, his tone carrying none of the warmth it once held for her. Edwin has spent decades studying our archives, and stands fully behind this finding. I would advise you, Priscilla, to consider carefully how you proceed from here. Your accusations, intended to remove a rival, have instead revealed a truth that reflects poorly on this pack's own history, not on the woman you sought to expose. Priscilla said nothing further, though the fury simmering beneath her composed exterior was evident to everyone in the room. She left the council chamber without another word, already turning over in her mind how she might salvage what remained of her position, though the path forward had grown considerably narrower than she had anticipated. For Alara, the days following the revelation passed in a strange, disorienting blur. She continued her care of Finn and Wren with the same steady devotion she had shown from the very beginning, but the world around her had shifted in ways she was still struggling to fully comprehend. Servants who had once whispered cruelly behind her back now regarded her with cautious uncertainty, unsure how to treat someone whose standing had transformed so suddenly and so completely. Miriam, ever practical, simply increased her instruction, teaching Alara not only the care of pups, but the finer points of manner etiquette, gently preparing her for a future that seemed, with each passing day, increasingly uncertain in scope, but undeniably different from the quiet obscurity she had known before. You must understand, Miriam said one afternoon, as she helped Alara fold fresh linens for the nursery, that this discovery changes how the pack must consider you, whether you wish it to or not. Blood matters greatly in our world, for better or for worse. You may find doors opening that were closed to you your entire life. I do not know if I want those doors to open, Alara admitted honestly. I have spent my whole life learning how to survive as an Omega, learning to make myself small enough not to draw attention. I do not know how to exist any differently. Then perhaps, Miriam said gently, it is time you learned. Cade, for his part, found himself grappling with implications far beyond the simple question of Alara's lineage. The discovery had cracked open something within him that he had not expected, a growing awareness of how deeply his pack's rigid hierarchy had been built not on any true measure of worth, but on decisions made generations ago by wolves seeking to protect their own power and convenience. He found himself thinking often of the countless Omegas throughout Ashgrove territory who might carry similar hidden histories, similar injustices buried beneath decades of assumed inferiority that had never been questioned. He raised the matter with his council of elders during a tense meeting held several days after the discovery, watching carefully as the older wolves shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly uneasy with the direction the conversation was taking. I have begun to wonder, Cade said, his voice steady and deliberate, how much of our pack's structure rests on assumptions we have never truly examined. If one bloodline could be so thoroughly erased and forgotten, what else might we have overlooked, deliberately or otherwise, in the name of maintaining order? My king, Alden said carefully, the structure of rank has served this pack for many generations. It provides stability, clear expectations, a framework within which every wolf understands their place and purpose. Or, Cade countered, it provides a convenient excuse for those born into privilege to dismiss the worth of those who are not, regardless of their actual capability or character. I have watched an Omega succeed where 4 highly ranked candidates failed entirely. I have learned that her family's disgrace was built on a lie constructed by wolves seeking to protect their own interests. I am no longer confident that our structure reflects anything close to true fairness, and I intend to examine it more closely in the months ahead. The council fell into uneasy silence, none quite willing to argue directly against their king, though the discomfort in the room was palpable. Cade did not press the matter further that day, understanding that such deep change could not be forced through in a single conversation, but the seed of reconsideration had been planted, and he had no intention of allowing it to wither unattended. That evening, he found Alara in the nursery garden, a small enclosed courtyard, where she had taken to bringing the pups for fresh air during the warmer afternoon hours. She sat on a stone bench beneath a flowering tree, Wren nestled against her chest, while Finn lay contentedly on a blanket beside her, reaching curiously toward a fallen blossom. Cade paused at the entrance to the garden, watching the peaceful scene for a long moment before announcing his presence. May I join you? He asked, an unusual note of uncertainty in his voice, for a man rarely given to hesitation. Of course, my king. Alara shifted slightly to make room on the bench, and Cade settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, though neither moved away from the proximity. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the pups in the golden afternoon light, before Cade finally spoke. "I raised the question of our pack's structure with the council today," he said. "I do not expect swift change. Traditions this deeply rooted rarely shift quickly, and I suspect many of the elders will resist for a long time to come. But I intend to keep asking the question, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes them." Alara turned to look at him, something warm and grateful passing across her expression. "That is a brave thing to attempt, my king. I know how deeply these traditions are held. I am tired of watching my pack dismiss the worth of people simply because of the circumstances of their birth," Cade said, his voice quiet but firm. "I watched it happen to your family for generations, built on a lie no one ever bothered to question. I do not wish to be the kind of leader who allows such injustice to continue, simply because challenging it proves inconvenient." Alara felt something shift within her chest, a warmth she had not expected to feel, watching this powerful man speak with such genuine conviction about fairness for people like her, people the pack had always considered beneath serious consideration. "You have changed a great deal," she observed softly, "since the night I first held your children in this manner." Cade turned to meet her gaze, and for a long moment neither spoke, the air between them charged with something neither had yet found the courage to name directly. "Perhaps," he said finally, his voice low, "I simply needed the right reason to change." Ren stirred against Alara's chest, letting out a small, contented sigh in her sleep, and both adults glanced down at the pup with matching soft smiles, the moment settling into something quietly domestic, comfortable in a way that neither had expected to find again after the grief that had defined so much of the past weeks and months. Finn reached up from his blanket, his small fingers grasping at the hem of his father's coat, and Cade reached down instinctively to steady his son's hand, the four of them forming, for just a moment, something that looked remarkably like a family, though none of them dared speak the word aloud just yet. Autumn settled over Ashgrove territory, painting the manor grounds in shades of amber and rust, and with the changing season came a gradual, undeniable shift in the way the pack regarded Alara Vance. She no longer moved through the halls with her eyes fixed firmly on the floor, though old habits of caution lingered in the careful way she still greeted those of higher standing. Finn and Ren had grown stronger with each passing week, their small personalities beginning to emerge in ways that delighted everyone who spent time in the nursery. Finn had proven himself curious and fearless, always reaching for whatever caught his attention, while Ren showed a quieter, more watchful nature, content to observe the world around her before deciding whether to engage with it. Cade's visits to the nursery had become a fixture of his daily routine, no longer a rare occurrence born of grief or duty, but a genuine desire to spend time with his children, and, though he had not yet fully admitted it even to himself, with Alara. Their conversations had grown easier over the passing weeks, filled with small observations about the pup's development, gentle debates about the best approach to a fussy afternoon, and, increasingly, quieter moments of shared reflection that ventured beyond the immediate concerns of parenthood, into deeper territory neither had expected to explore. Not everyone in the pack had softened toward the changes unfolding within the manor, however. Priscilla Thorne, having failed in her attempt to discredit Alara through rumor and accusation, had retreated from open confrontation, but not from her underlying ambitions. She watched from the shadows of pack gatherings, her sharp eyes tracking every interaction between the king and the woman who had so thoroughly disrupted her plans, calculating and recalculating how she might yet reclaim the position she believed rightfully belonged to someone of her standing, rather than a woman only recently discovered to carry a scrap of forgotten bloodline. It was during the Autumn Harvest Festival, an event that drew nearly every member of the pack to the Great Hall for an evening of feasting and celebration, that matters finally came to a head. Alara had been invited to attend, a gesture that itself represented a significant departure from tradition, as Omegas were rarely included in such gatherings except in service roles. She arrived dressed simply but neatly. Finn and Ren settled for the evening under Miriam's watchful care, so that Alara might, for one rare evening, experience something resembling a normal social occasion. The great hall buzzed with conversation and laughter, long tables laden with the season's harvest, musicians playing lively tunes near the raised dais where Cade sat, though his attention drifted repeatedly toward the entrance, watching for Alara's arrival with an eagerness he made only a modest effort to conceal. When she finally entered, several heads turned in her direction, some curious, some still openly skeptical of the strange turn her circumstances had taken over the past months. Priscilla, seated near the front of the hall in a position of prominence she had carefully cultivated over the years, watched Alara's entrance with narrowed eyes. She rose from her seat and crossed the room with deliberate purpose, intercepting Alara before she could find a place among the other attendees. "How fortunate for you," Priscilla said, her voice pitched just loud enough to draw the attention of those nearby, "that a smudge of old ink has elevated you from the kitchens to a seat at tonight's celebration. Tell me, do you truly believe blood alone makes you worthy of such a place, or do you simply enjoy the attention it has brought you?" Conversation nearby quieted as several guests turned to watch the exchange unfold. Alara felt the old, familiar urge to shrink away, to lower her eyes, and slip quietly from the confrontation, as she had done countless times throughout her life. But something within her, strengthened by months of proving her worth through steady, patient care rather than empty rank, held her steady this time. "I do not believe blood alone makes anyone worthy of anything," Alara said, her voice calm and clear despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "I believe worth is shown through actions, through how a person treats others, and how they meet their responsibilities. I have cared for the Alpha King's children with everything I have, regardless of what my blood does or does not contain. If that has earned me a place at this table, I am grateful for it, but I did not seek it out through scheming or cruelty toward others." The pointed reference to Priscilla's own tactics was not lost on those listening, and a few quiet murmurs of approval rippled through the nearby guests. Priscilla's expression tightened, her composure fraying at the edges, as she realized the confrontation was not unfolding in her favor. "You speak boldly for an Omega," she said, her voice sharper now, less controlled. "Perhaps," Alara replied evenly. "It is time Omegas were allowed to speak boldly, when they have earned the right to be heard." Cade, who had risen from the dais the moment he noticed the confrontation beginning, arrived at Alara's side, just as Priscilla opened her mouth to respond, his presence effectively silencing whatever retort she had prepared. "Priscilla," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a king whose patience had finally reached its limit. "I believe you have made your feelings toward Alara sufficiently clear over these past months. I would advise you to consider carefully whether continuing this pattern serves your interests, or whether it might be time to accept that my decisions regarding my children's care are not open for further debate." Priscilla's face flushed with a mixture of humiliation and barely restrained anger, but she was not foolish enough to argue further with the king in front of the entire gathered pack. She offered a stiff, shallow bow and retreated to her seat, though the venomous glance she cast toward Alara before turning away promised the tension between them was far from fully resolved. The remainder of the evening passed more smoothly, though the confrontation had left its mark on the atmosphere of the hall. Cade remained close to Alara for much of the celebration, and their conversation, quiet and easy despite the many curious eyes still tracking their interaction, drifted eventually to the topic that had been building between them for weeks, without either quite finding the courage to address it directly. "You handled that with more grace than I could have managed," Cade said, as they stepped out onto a quiet balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens, seeking a brief respite from the noise and attention of the hall. "I have watched you endure far worse than tonight's confrontation, without ever once losing your composure. I find myself wondering how you managed it for so many years, before any of this began." "I did not always manage it well," Alara admitted, leaning against the stone railing, the cool autumn air, a welcome relief after the warmth of the crowded hall. "There were many nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering what I had done to deserve such treatment, wondering if I would ever be seen as anything more than beneath notice. I simply learned, over time, that surviving required a kind of quiet endurance that eventually became habit." Cade moved closer, close enough that Alara could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the chill of the evening air. "You should never have had to endure any of it," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I think of it often, how differently your life might have unfolded had the truth of your family never been buried, how much suffering might have been avoided." "Perhaps," Alara said softly, "but I do not know if I would trade my path for another, even knowing what I know now. It led me here, to this moment, to your children, and I find I cannot regret that, regardless of what came before." Cade reached out, hesitant at first, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, the gesture tender and unhurried, in a way that made Alara's breath catch slightly in her throat. "I have found myself thinking of you far more than I ever anticipated," he admitted quietly, "in ways that extend well beyond my gratitude for how you have cared for Finn and Ren. I do not fully understand what this feeling is, or where it might lead, but I no longer wish to pretend it does not exist." Alara met his gaze, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and disbelief that such words could truly be directed at her, an Omega who had spent her entire life believing herself unworthy of such attention. "I have felt something similar," she confessed softly, "though I have tried, many times, to convince myself it was foolish to hope for anything more than what I already have." The moonlight cast a soft silver glow over the garden below, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with the quiet, tentative beginning of something neither had fully expected to find again after the losses and struggles that had shaped both their pasts so profoundly. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the grounds of Ashgrove Manor with a fine layer of frost that clung to the bare branches of the garden trees and turned the courtyard where Alara so often brought the pups into a quiet, glittering landscape. Finn and Ren, now old enough to sit upright and take a curious interest in the world around them, watched the falling snow with wide, delighted eyes from the warmth of the nursery window, and Alara found herself smiling more often than she could remember smiling in all her years before this one. The relationship between Alara and Cade had continued to deepen through the passing weeks, though both moved carefully, aware of the many eyes still watching, still waiting for any sign of weakness they might use against either of them. Cade had made no formal announcement of his growing feelings, understanding that such a declaration would carry enormous weight for a pack still adjusting to the revelations of the autumn, but the shift in his behavior toward her was evident to anyone who spent time in the manor's halls. He no longer simply visited the nursery out of concern for his children. He sought Alara out deliberately, finding excuses to walk with her through the gardens, to share meals in the quiet hours after the pups had been settled for the night, to simply exist in her presence, in ways that spoke louder than any formal declaration could have managed. Priscilla Thorne, watching these developments with growing desperation, made one final attempt to reclaim her fading influence within the pack. She approached Alden privately, her earlier accusations abandoned in favor of a new strategy, one aimed not at discrediting Alara directly, but at questioning whether the king's growing attachment to her represented sound judgment for the future of the pack's leadership. "Consider carefully what message this sends," she urged the elder, during a private conversation in his study. The Alpha King, growing close to a woman only recently elevated from Omega status, however tenuous her claimed connection to his bloodline might be. What will the neighboring territories think of such an arrangement? What will it mean for the stability of succession, should this relationship continue to deepen? Alden, though he had grown considerably more sympathetic toward Alara over the preceding months, could not entirely dismiss the political weight of Priscilla's concerns. Ashgrove territory did not exist in isolation, and matters of leadership and succession carried implications that stretched far beyond the walls of the manor itself. He raised the matter with Cade during their next private audience, choosing his words with unusual care. "My king, I do not question your right to choose companionship as you see fit," Alden began, "but I would be failing in my duty if I did not raise the political considerations at play. Other territories watch our pack closely, and any perceived instability in matters of succession or leadership could invite challenges we would rather avoid." Cade listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive, a marked change from the reactive anger that had characterized his early responses to such concerns. "I understand the weight of what you raise, Alden," he said finally, "but I have spent these past months watching this pack's traditions cause genuine harm to people who deserved better, built on foundations of convenience and prejudice, rather than true wisdom. I do not intend to make decisions about my own life, or my children's future, based solely on fear of how other territories might perceive them. If Ashgrove's strength depends on maintaining injustice, then perhaps it is not strength worth preserving in its current form. And if other territories see this as weakness rather than principle," Alden pressed carefully, "how do you intend to answer that challenge, should it come?" Cade's expression hardened with quiet resolve. "I have led this pack through difficult times before, Alden. I do not fear difficulty. I fear becoming the kind of leader who allows fear of judgment to dictate choices I know to be right. If challenges come, we will face them as we have faced every challenge before, with strength and unity, not with the false stability of maintaining traditions that no longer serve us honestly. The conversation left Alden with much to consider, and though he did not fully abandon his reservations, he found himself, in the days that followed, watching Alara with renewed attention, observing not just her care for the pups, but her growing confidence, her thoughtful contributions during the rare occasions she was included in broader pack discussions, the quiet dignity with which she navigated a position that would have overwhelmed many others entirely. It was on a crisp winter evening, snow falling steadily outside the nursery window, that Cade finally found the courage to speak the words he had been carrying for weeks. He found Alara in the rocking chair, Wren asleep against her shoulder, while Finn dozed peacefully in his cradle nearby, the room warm and quiet in the golden glow of the fireplace. He settled into the chair across from her, watching the peaceful scene for a long moment before speaking. "I have spoken with Alden today," he said, "about the concerns some in the pack hold, regarding my growing feelings for you." He raised valid points about political stability, about how other territories might perceive such a change in circumstance for someone of your background. Alara's chest tightened with familiar anxiety, bracing herself for words she feared might signal the end of whatever fragile connection had grown between them. "I understand, my king. I have always known that whatever this is between us could not last, given everything at stake for you and for the pack." "That is not what I came to say." Cade's voice was gentle but firm, and he reached across the small distance between them to take her hand, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "I told Alden that I would not allow fear of judgment to dictate choices I know to be right. And I know, with more certainty than I have felt about anything since Mira's passing, that choosing you is right, Alara. Not despite the challenges it might bring, but because you have shown me, every single day since you first walked into this nursery, what true worth looks like, when it is not measured by rank or bloodline, but by character and devotion." Alara's eyes filled with tears she could not quite hold back, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice, by the weight of feelings she had spent months trying to convince herself were foolish to hope for. "I never imagined," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "that my life could hold something like this. I spent so many years believing I would always be invisible, always beneath notice. And now, here I am, holding your children, hearing you speak to me, with such honesty and warmth. It feels almost too much to be real." "It is real," Cade said firmly, moving to kneel beside her chair, so their eyes met on level ground, a gesture that stripped away, at least for this private moment, every distinction of rank and standing that had once separated them so completely. "And I intend to make it more real still, in whatever ways you will allow me to. I do not know what the future holds, or how the pack will ultimately respond to the choices ahead of us, but I know that I want to face that future with you beside me, not as a temporary arrangement born of necessity, but as something permanent, something chosen deliberately and without reservation." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the manor grounds in soft, quiet white, while inside the warm glow of the nursery, two small pups slept peacefully, unaware that the bond they had recognized instinctively from their very first moments of life was about to be embraced, fully and openly, by the two people who had come to mean everything to each of them. Spring arrived at Ashgrove territory with a gentleness that felt, to Alara, like the natural conclusion of everything the long winter had quietly prepared. The manor grounds bloomed with fresh color, the gardens where she had once sat with the pups beneath bare branches, now bursting with early blossoms, and the entire pack seemed to breathe more easily as the harsh months gave way to warmth and renewal. Finn and Wren, now nearly a year old, had grown into lively, curious pups, taking their first unsteady steps across the nursery floor, under the watchful, delighted eyes of everyone who spent time in their presence. Cade had not wasted the winter months in idle contemplation. True to the resolve he had spoken aloud that snowy evening, he had begun the slow, deliberate work of reshaping the harshest aspects of the pack's rigid hierarchy, meeting regularly with the Council of Elders to propose changes that many had once considered unthinkable. It was not swift work, nor was it without significant resistance, but Cade proved patient and unwavering, in ways that surprised even those who had known him for years. He argued, meeting after meeting, that a pack's true strength lay not in rigid distinctions of rank, but in recognizing and rewarding the genuine character and capability of every wolf within it, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. The restrictions that had once confined Omegas to the lowest, most menial positions within the pack began to loosen gradually. Young Omegas who showed particular skill or talent found new opportunities opening before them, opportunities that would have been unthinkable only a year before. Training programs once reserved exclusively for higher-ranked wolves opened their doors to any pack member willing to work hard and prove their capability. It was not a perfect transformation, and Cade knew well that generations of ingrained prejudice would not vanish overnight. But the foundation had been laid, and he intended to keep building upon it for as long as he held the title of Alpha King. Priscilla Thorne, having failed repeatedly in her attempts to reclaim influence through opposition, eventually chose a different path, quietly withdrawing from the more prominent social circles of the pack, and focusing instead on rebuilding her own family's standing through more honest means. Whether this reflected genuine change of heart or simple pragmatic acceptance of a battle she could no longer win, only she truly knew. But her open hostility toward Alara faded into a distant, cool civility that, while far from warm, no longer posed any real threat. On a bright afternoon in early spring, the entire pack gathered in the Great Hall once more, though this occasion carried none of the tension that had marked the Autumn Harvest Festival months before. Cade stood at the center of the hall, Alara beside him, both of them dressed in fine but simple attire, befitting the significance of the announcement he was about to make. Finn and Wren, too young to fully understand the gravity of the moment, sat contentedly in Miriam's arms, near the front of the gathered crowd, occasionally babbling happily at the sight of so many familiar faces turned toward them. "I stand before you today," Cade began, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, "to formally announce what many of you have already come to understand through the events of these past months. Alara Vance, who came to this manor as a woman without rank, without recognition, and without the acknowledgement her true history deserved, has earned her place beside me, and beside my children, through devotion, through character, and through a strength of spirit that no title or bloodline could ever fully capture. I intend to take her as my mate, and I ask this pack to recognize her not as an afterthought of circumstance, but as someone who has proven, beyond any doubt, that worth is measured by what a person does and who they choose to be, not simply by the rank they were born into." A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd, though it carried far more warmth than resistance, the months of witnessing Alara's steady devotion to the pups having gradually won over even many of the most skeptical members of the pack. Alden, standing near the front of the gathering, inclined his head in solemn acknowledgement, his earlier reservations having softened considerably as he watched the genuine transformation both Alara and Cade had undergone throughout the preceding seasons. Cade turned to Alara, taking both her hands in his expression open and unguarded in a way that would have seemed impossible to imagine on the cold, grief-hardened man he had been at the very beginning of this story. "I also wish to announce," he continued, addressing the gathered pack once more, "that going forward, this territory will formally recognize the abolition of the harshest restrictions once placed upon Omegas within our ranks. Every wolf in this pack, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, will be given the opportunity to prove their worth through their character, their skill, and their contribution to this community. I have learned, in ways I did not expect, that the strength of a pack lies not in how strictly it enforces division, but in how fully it embraces the genuine value each of its members has to offer." The hall erupted into applause, some enthusiastic, some more measured, but overwhelmingly supportive of a change that, while still requiring years of careful implementation to fully take root, represented a genuine turning point for Ashgrove territory. Alara stood at Cade's side, tears of overwhelming joy gathering in her eyes, as she looked out over the crowd that had once dismissed her so completely, now watching her with expressions ranging from respect to genuine warmth. Later that evening, after the celebrations had wound down and the great hall had emptied of its guests, Cade and Alara found themselves once more in the nursery, the familiar quiet of the room, a welcome contrast to the excitement of the day. Finn and Wren, exhausted from the long celebration, slept soundly in their cradles, their small chests rising and falling in peaceful, contented rhythm. "Do you remember," Cade said softly, settling beside Alara near the window where moonlight spilled gently across the floor. The night I came to this very room, intending to remove you entirely, certain that an Omega had no place near my children. I remember, Alara said, smiling at the memory that had once felt so frightening and now seemed almost impossibly distant. I was certain you would have me reassigned before nightfall. I very nearly did, Kate admitted, reaching for her hand. But my children knew something I did not yet understand. They recognized in you what this entire pack had spent generations trying to hide and deny, a truth that no amount of erased ink or forgotten record could ever fully extinguish. They chose you, Alara, before any of us understood why, and in doing so, they gave all of us the chance to become better than we once were. Alara leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, as she watched their children sleep peacefully in the soft moonlight. They gave me a family, she said quietly, when I believed I would spend my entire life alone. I do not think I can ever fully express what that means to me. You do not need to express it, Cade said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. I see it every single day, in the way you care for them, in the way you have transformed not just this nursery, but this entire pack, simply by refusing to let the world's cruelty define your worth. Whatever challenges still lie ahead of us, I know now, without any doubt, that we will face them together, as a family bound not just by blood, but by choice. Outside, the stars scattered brightly across the clear spring sky, watching over the manor where a king who had once ruled through cold distance had learned. Through the persistent instincts of two small pups and the quiet strength of a woman, the world had nearly forgotten what it truly meant to lead with an open heart. And in the nursery where it had all begun, two children slept soundly, safe and loved, having chosen, long before anyone else understood why, the family that would carry them forward into every bright and hopeful day still waiting to unfold.